Today's question is about the specifics of exposure compensation and how it works. I'll tell you all about it on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there everybody, welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions right here on Adorama TV. Hopefully you're already a subscriber. If not, go ahead and click that button. Also use the little bell so you get notifications of all the latest and greatest photo content from myself and the other photo hosts right here on Adorama TV. Also, I am hosting an online music and action photography workshop for all skill levels of photography. If you're watching this the day it comes out, it's happening this Friday, October 16th, 2020. Don't forget to sign up. Head on over there right after you watch this video. Go to shootfromthepit.com. You can get all kinds of information about it and check that out there. All right, let's get right on with today's show. I've got a question sent in by Jeff S., and he wants to know, how does exposure compensation actually work? Does it just change shutter speed, aperture, and ISO? If so, how does it decide which setting or settings to change? Jeff, that's a great question. And as usual with my videos, what I'm going to do first is just back up a little bit to make sure we're all on the same page before I answer your specific question. We really need to understand how the camera handles exposure before we can get into how to compensate or why you would want to compensate for that. Now, when we talk about exposure, all we're referring to really is how bright or how dark the image is. And the exposure triangle is made up of three settings that put together control how bright or how dark the image is, what your exposure is. Those settings you probably know are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. I've done videos about it. There are plenty of videos and information about the exposure triangle and what those three settings actually do. But for the sake of this conversation, all you need to know is that if you go into full program mode, right, which is usually the P mode on the camera, full program where the camera does everything for you, when it comes to exposure, the camera is going to pick all three of those settings in the exposure triangle to get what it considers to be the correct exposure. Now, I always put that in quotes because there's really no such thing as the correct exposure, because you can make creative decisions. You might decide you want your image to be a little brighter, a little darker, and the camera doesn't really know what the correct exposure is, but it's going to try its best to get you where you want to be. And what it does is it sort of looks at the whole scene and averages out the bright parts and the dark parts and just tries to give you the best possible exposure so that nothing is really too far blown out in either direction. And it does this by it wants to make everything 18% gray, which is like a middle gray. And now, just as a sidebar, you can use different metering modes like spot metering and center metering and things like that. I'll put a link to a video I've done about that in the past, but I'm not going to use those today. We're not going to get too far into that, just for simplicity, because Jeff's question was about exposure compensation. So that auto mode is going to work that way, that program mode. Now, there are other auto modes that work the same way, with the camera deciding what the correct exposure is, right? Those other modes are going to give you some creative control by allowing you to pick one setting that's going to, you might have one setting that you want to pick for a creative reason, not for an exposure reason, but just for creative reasons. Like, for example, Aperture Priority is one of those other auto modes. On Canon, it's an AV. It says AV instead of P. It's going to be AV. That stands for Aperture Value. Some other camera brands, it might just be an A, for example. But the way that works is you're going to set the aperture. You pick the aperture, you're going to lock that in, and then you might make that decision of a specific aperture because you want to control the depth of field. If you shoot wide open, for example, which are those low aperture numbers like 2.8 or smaller, that's going to give you a really shallow depth of field, and you might want that for the look of your image. But you don't care so much about exposure, right? So if you're on aperture priority mode, you're going to pick the aperture, and then the camera is going to pick the corresponding shutter speed to let the right amount of light in to expose your image properly, right? And then shutter priority is the opposite, where you pick the shutter speed. That's usually on Canon, it's TV mode, which stands for time value. It could just be an S on some other brands. And you pick the shutter speed. You might want to have, let's say, a fast shutter speed to freeze action if you're shooting sports or something that's moving fast. Or you might have a slow shutter speed because you want to make blurs or pans or those kind of things. And then you're going to set that. It's going to lock it in and not going to change. And then the camera's going to pick the correct aperture to get the right exposure, the right amount of light in to expose your image properly. Right? Now, in either of these cases, it's not going to touch the ISO unless you're using the auto ISO mode, which that allows the camera to change the ISO a little bit if you want it to. But again, that's also an auto setting where at the end of the day, the bottom line with all of these auto settings is that it's going to give you some creative control, but they really don't let you control exposure if you want to do anything that's different than what the camera thinks is the proper exposure. So this is really where exposure compensation comes into play. You can tell the camera to over or underexpose your image in relation to what it thinks is the correct exposure. And I'm going to show you how this works. You might have seen this camera hanging down here. I've got the my Canon 5D Mark IV hanging from a boom arm here, and with a 24-105 lens on it. And I'm going to control the settings from a tablet that I have right here in front of me that you can't see. And then if we look through the lens, you can see here, I'm going to photograph this lens cap, right? Now, this Canon lens cap, I've got it on a table that is relatively neutral. It's brown, but it's kind of not too bright, not too dark, but it's a dark cap, right? It's a black cap. I really want to expose so that I can see the detail on this cap, right? I want to read the Canon on here, and it's black on black, right? So all I really care about is the exposure as far as the cap is. I don't care so much about what the background does in this case. So let's go in here. I'm on exposure priority, as you can see, and I've preset my ISO at 6400. I'm using a really high ISO. Doesn't really matter, it's just for demonstration purposes, but I wanted to make sure we had enough light in here with my LEDs. And I'm at 5.6 at 6400, and those are set. I'm at aperture priority, so I've set 5.6. And if I half button press here, you can see the camera is going to select 1/100th of a second as the shutter speed. If I were to take the picture right now, actually, let's go ahead. Boom. So when I take the picture, it's 1/100th of a second, right? So that's what it thinks is the proper exposure. Now, if I want it to be brighter or darker than that, I can go in here. Let's bring up the tablet here. And if you take a look right here, the way you change exposure compensation on most cameras, there's a little plus minus, and you usually hit that, and then there's a dial, and you can go up or down, in most cases, about 3 stops in either direction. The plus is going to be brighter, and the minus is going to be darker. So in this case, what I can do is I can say, overexpose 1 stop. So now if I look, I'm still at 5.6, I'm still at 6400, but if I look at what the camera's going to do, 50th of a second now, that's 1 stop brighter, right? Because that's slower, a slower shutter speed. I was at 100, now I'm at a 50th. So that is going to be 1 stop brighter if I were to take the picture. I could, of course, go 2 stops brighter, and you can guess exactly what that's going to be, 25th of a second, right? The same thing with 3 stops. Now I'm at a 13th of a second. So that's going to be 3 stops, and you can see the difference. It's obviously much brighter. So let's go back to 0. Now, obviously, because this is a neutral background, it's kind of a, not too bright, not too dark, the exposure at 0 is going to be pretty much spot on. It's pretty much what I want. Now, that's going to change, though. Let's pull out, look at this. I have a black felt. It's a little wrinkly, but let's put the black felt down on the table. Try to not show all the wrinkles. And put our lens cap here again. Now we've got black on black, right? I'm still at 5.6 on aperture priority, still at 5.6, still at 6400. Let's see what the camera thinks. Remember, at 0, it was at 100th of a second before. Now it's at 50th of a second. So even though I know creatively I want the exposure to be correct on the cap, I still want really to be at 100th of a second, because that's what it should be in my mind. Right now, it's looking at this whole frame, it's seeing all that darkness, and it's lightening up because it doesn't know what I want to expose for. It's just seeing the whole scene. Now again, you could use spot metering and all of that, but we're not talking about that today. Just in general, how exposure compensation works. So it's seeing that, and it's going to brighten up the whole image. So in this case, if I did -1 exposure compensation, and I checked it, now it's back to 100th of a second. This is actually how I would want to expose this. I want the background to be a little darker because it's black. That's what I want. But really, I want that cap to be the same exposure. I want that to be 100th of a second. Now, of course, I could really get even more creative. I could go down a little bit more, 2 stops down, and now, of course, it's going to be 1/60th, right? So now it's a bit brighter, a bit darker. So that's what the camera does. Now, let's go back to 0. And let's go the opposite, right? Let's get rid of my black felt. Now I've got a white bounce card here. Let's put that as our background and get our cap on there. And again, we're back to 0, no exposure compensation. And what does the camera think? 400th of a second. That's 2 stops darker than I was when I had the neutral background because, of course, it's seeing all that white. But again, now the problem is because it's darkening everything, that cap is way too dark. It's 2 stops darker than I really would want, right? So in this case, I would take my exposure compensation and go up 2 stops to get my cap back to 100th of a second. Now again, creatively I might decide that's a little too bright or too dark, but that cap now is the same exposure. It's not as important with a lens cap, but imagine you're photographing a person, right? And you don't want their face to be completely blown out or underexposed just because of the background they're against, right? So that's when you would really use exposure compensation. That's how it works. That's what you would use it for. Now, Jeff, since you asked about what settings it changes and how it decides. Now, since I'm on Aperture Priority mode, on AV mode, it's only going to change the shutter speed, right? So it really just depends what mode you're in. When I adjust that exposure compensation, it's only going to touch, I've only given the camera permission to change the shutter speed. Now, if I was on shutter priority mode, guess what? It would change the aperture, right? So the setting that it changes is based on what mode you are on. And again, that's about taking back control so that you can get the look that you want creatively and then let the camera do the exposure. The classic example for when you would use this is someone in snow, for example, right? If you're photographing somebody skiing and maybe they're wearing dark clothes and a ski cap or whatever, and they're really, really dark, but they might be small in the frame. If they're skiing and you're shooting with a long lens, if you use an auto mode, it's going to see all that white of the snow and it's going to darken everything down just like it did here with my lens cap. So you might set up your exposure compensation to be up 1 or 2 stops. You have to kind of figure it out to taste and see what you like, but 1 or 2 stops to brighten everything up so that, yeah, the snow is going to be brighter, but it's white. It's supposed to be bright. So that's why you would use exposure compensation. Now, as far as full program mode, Jeff, with it changing settings, I really wasn't sure what it would do, which settings it would change if you're on full program mode. I've never used full program in a million years, so I wasn't sure how it would work. I tested it with Canon. The Canon changes the shutter speed only. So if you're in full program, it's setting all 3 of those modes, and then as you do exposure compensation, it's only changing the shutter speed. Other brands might be different than that. I don't have them to test, but it's going to leave the ISO and it's going to leave the aperture. So my opinion, though, full program is not something I really would use. If you're going to use an auto mode, you're better off with aperture priority or shutter priority just to have that amount of control so that you can decide how your image is going to look and then use exposure compensation. If you're like me and you shoot all manual, exposure compensation has no effect on your final image. The only difference you're really going to see is on the meter. Let's go back in here and let's change this over to full manual. And I'm going to expose at 100th of a second at 5.6, which was where I wanted it before. And let's go back to the neutral background, right? So this was our first setting when we were on aperture priority. And if I push the button down halfway and see what the meter is doing, it's dead center. You see where it is right in the middle there? So the camera thinks this is the proper exposure. Now, if I were to overexpose, the meter will show me that. It'll show that it's, underexposed. I went to F8. The meter's showing me, the camera thinks that it's a stop underexposed. If I was on an auto mode, it would open up, it would brighten it up 1 stop. But because I'm on manual and I'm setting all 3 of those settings, it's showing me in the meter what it thinks, but it's not having any effect. It's just telling me what the camera's just telling me what it thinks it should do. But again, since I'm on manual, it's not going to make that change. So I have some people say, no, manual, it does have an effect. It'll show you in the meter, but it actually won't make any changes for you, right? So it's just going to laugh at you and think that you're wrong. Now, again, with meter settings and things, there are, in the newer cameras, like the Canon 1DX Mark III or the R5 or the R6, they have advanced metering modes that are actually really cool that prioritize the focus area. So it'll use cool things like face detection to pick the best exposure regardless of the background. So even if you are photographing somebody on snow, if it sees a face or a person, what you're focused on, it will actually prioritize the person when it calculates the exposure in an auto mode. I still prefer to set everything manually, but you can use exposure compensation in certain situations to take back some of that control and override the camera's best exposure guess. Thanks, Jeff. I hope that answers your question and helps out other people as well. Remember to subscribe, like, and comment down below. I have the workshop this Friday at shootfromthepit.com. Make sure you go ahead and check that out. And of course, as always, if you have photo questions you want me to answer here on the show, go to AskDavidBergman.com. I'll do my best to answer as many of those as I can. I'm back here every Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern with a new show. Hopefully I'll see you back here next time, right here on Ask David Bergman.